What's going on, U.S. History people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
We got video number 34 for you today. The U.S. enters World War I. So, Mr. Lawrence, start off telling us about causes of World War I.
All right, so one thing that we know when we studied World War I, going back to your global history days, is the United States does not get involved in this global conflict immediately. But we even have to kind of go a little farther back and understand what causes World War I. What are those main causes for this conflict? And if you can think back to those main ideas, M-A-I-N, we're going to start off with the M as in militarism. So during this time period, in the late early 1900s, we see the growth of militarism across the world, specifically in major European powers. So countries are investing a lot of money in new technology, specifically to grow their armies and navies that we've talked about in previous videos. The A stands for the alliance system. So alliance systems are developing throughout places like Europe, and we see the growth of what will be known as the Central Powers with countries like Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. On the other side, we see allied powers such as Great Britain, France, and Russia. Eventually, we see the U.S. join that side and several other nations. And what's going to be very important is a lot of these alliances will be based off the idea that if one country is attacked, all others will have to join in to support them, and this is going to lead us to all-out global conflict. The I is for imperialism, the continual competition for colonies across the globe, and N is nationalism. So we see the growth of that extreme pride in individual cultures and push for independence. Specifically, we see this in regions like the Balkans, which eventually leads to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. With this assassination, it really is the spark that starts the war. It puts the alliance system into practice, and eventually we see the German invasion of Belgium and then eventually into France, leading us to what we see as what we consider World War I. So when we focus on World War I, just specifically on the Western Front, it was kind of the most predominant front from the American perspective. It was a stalemate that lasted for years. We see the development of trench warfare and also new technologies leading to weaponry that causes mass casualties such as the machine gun, poison gas, airplanes, tanks, and U-boats, which stands for what, Mr. Norris?
Unterwasser boats or submarines. So let's discuss, how does the U.S. go from neutrality to war? Well, the U.S. had a tradition of isolation and neutrality going back to Washington's farewell address. If you remember, his ghost is still haunting us throughout this course. Woodrow Wilson will actually be reelected in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." That didn't last long because the U.S. enters war the following April. And the U.S. had many connections to allies. There were strong cultural and commercial ties to England and France. And the Lusitania is an example of unrestricted submarine warfare in which the Germans engaged in. This was a sinking of a British passenger ship by a German U-boat, and of the 1,200 people that were killed, 128 of them were Americans. So this German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare is what helped lead the U.S. to get involved in World War I. Germany will threaten to sink ships that entered Allied waters. Anybody that was not allied with Germany, they would sink their ships. Also, we have the Zimmerman note, this cartoon pictured up here, or Zimmerman telegram. This was a proposed German alliance with Mexico. The Germans encouraged Mexico to attack the United States, and in return they would get all this land back from when they lost it during the Mexican-American War. Land such as New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona.
Mr. Norris, do you know why they called it the Zimmerman telegram, or sometimes referred to as the Zimmerman note?
The dude's last name was Zimmerman?
Oh, very creative. As we said earlier in the video, the U.S. does not jump into World War I right away. It takes time, and actually the United States really jumps in at the very tail end and roughly is fighting for about a year on the side of the Allies. So Wilson will eventually ask Congress to declare war on Germany in 1917. When you look at all those causes, such as unrestricted submarine warfare, and finally with the Zimmerman telegram, it pushes the U.S. into the conflict. There is eventually the passage of the Selective Service Act, so we see the reestablishment of the draft in order to grow the U.S. military. We haven't seen this since the Civil War, so there's going to be this push for what's called total war, that all aspects of society will be focused on winning the war, whether it's industry, whether it's selling war bonds, and drafting men into the military. One of the major battles the United States fights in is known as Belleau Wood, where they suffer over 8,000 casualties. Now, for the U.S., this was a major battle, but compared to what the Europeans were facing, where millions and millions of men were being killed over several years, it's not as large, but for the United States, definitely a very big deal for all the men who were lost. So we see an armistice in 1918, which eventually brings an end to fighting. As a result of this war, we see millions killed. Huge regions of the globe were completely devastated, and the U.S. will see over 100,000 deaths in this conflict. So up to World War I, this was the worst war in human history with the most destruction that humans had ever seen. Unfortunately, it will only be seconded to eventually World War II.
So push for peace. Wilson is going to travel to France for the peace conference at the Palace of Versailles, pictured here, the Hall of Mirrors. And he will propose 14 points for an enduring peace. So you don't need to know all 14 points, but some big ideas are freedom of the seas, so that idea of not getting attacked by ships for shipping with other countries. Also free trade between countries, getting rid of tariffs. Self-determination, or the ability of countries to determine their own form of government and elect their own officials. Reduction of arms, so to reduce the militarism aspect we saw in Maine. And then finally, the most important part was the Association of Nations, which would transform into the League of Nations. Now, the treaty itself, the Treaty of Versailles itself, is going to punish Germany, and they will have to accept responsibility for the war. They will also have to pay reparations and reduce their military significantly. And they will also give up their overseas colonies. And this is going to lead to a lot of resentment in Germany. Now, Wilson agreed to this. He didn't really fully support it, but he agreed to it in order to see the formation of the League of Nations. Now, when he comes home, he's going to face a lot of challenges. So many people in Congress, particularly the Senate, are going to want to return to isolationism and neutrality in the U.S. following the war. So the Senate will never approve the Treaty of Versailles. This is important to note. The U.S. does not join the League of Nations. You can see that in this political cartoon here, this bridge, which represents the League of Nations. The keystone piece, or the most important piece, is the USA, not a part of that bridge. So this bridge will collapse, as the League of Nations will without them. So again, very important. Please highlight for us, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations.
So, Mr. Norris, I read that Woodrow Wilson thought this was a major, major failure for himself and for the United Nations, that he spent time going all over the United States, giving speeches, trying to get people to support this, trying to get members of the Senate to support this, but ultimately it was a failure. I think he got so stressed out, eventually had a stroke, and was really incapacitated for a while as president.
Yeah, definitely. A couple months, nobody really heard from him except his wife, and some people argue that his wife was the de facto president for that time.
All right, so let's do a quick recap of U.S. entering World War I. It's very important, again, going back to your study of world history tied into U.S., the main causes of the war, what caused this conflict to happen, understanding that America was being neutral, staying with our traditions as a nation, staying out of those European conflicts for the majority of the war. Eventually, unrestricted warfare, the sinking of the Lusitania, and the Zimmerman telegram will be pushing the U.S. into war over a period of time. We know that when the war comes to an end and the Allies try to declare victory, Wilson promotes his 14 points for peace to try and prevent any other major world wars from happening. It culminates in the Treaty of Versailles that really punishes Germany, and eventually the U.S. will never join the League of Nations because the treaty was never ratified by the Senate.
All right, guys, thanks for watching. Look forward to see you back here for video number 35. We're going to look at World War I on the home front. Best of luck on all your tests this year, especially the one in June, and have a good day.